Hello, my name is Michelle Scott Tucker and I'm here on behalf of the Sydney Mechanics School of the Arts and the Thomas Keneally Centre. My grateful thanks to them and to Oscar and Friends booksellers. I'm the author of Elizabeth MacArthur, A Life at the Edge of the World, a historical biography about a fascinating woman. I was interested in her story because the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories we tell about the past say something about who we are as people today. And I got interested in her as an intelligent, interesting, successful woman who established the Australian wool industry, and yet her husband got all the credit for it. She was also a key player in the first 60 years of the colony, and yet she's not a household name and should be. Over 60 years she established farms, she established businesses, she had 9 children. Her adventures were amazing and intense, and yet we don't talk about her enough. And so in writing this book, I wanted to lift her and other women, Australian women of history, up into the light so that we could find out more about the early days of the Australian colony. She arrived in Australia in 1790. Basically, she was a Jane Austen heroine who married a Wickham instead of a Darcy. She married a very difficult man and arrived in New South Wales only 2 years after the colony had been established. And over the next 60 years, she established her own family farm and did extraordinarily well and secured the future for her children. Along the way, she fled from an Irish uprising. Her husband was involved in a military coup, and in fact her husband was away for up to 12 years at a time, and it was she who managed the farms, who managed the businesses, while her husband was on the other side of the world. It was Elizabeth who shipped the first commercial quantities of wool to London, and yet it was her husband who ended up on the $2 note and not her. So I think in telling Elizabeth's story and telling it in a compelling, readable, page-turning way, we can change the stories that we tell about ourselves and change the way we look at Australian history. It's time that we stopped looking at the histories of white men at work and started looking at more diverse stories around us, because the depth and breadth of the stories that are there in the historical records are truly amazing. Elizabeth was a wonderful farmer, but she's not the only farm woman in the records. There were plenty of women who were farming on their own, with their husbands, or in the absence of their husbands. And yet when we think of the Australian farmer, we usually think of a lone man in a hat, and that story is just not right. In Elizabeth's world, she was unusual, but not especially so. She was also friends with every governor, right through from the first governor, Governor Phillip, right through to the 1850s. She was a player in the history and the politics of our society, and we really should know a lot more about her than we do. She had 9 children along the way, and yet she still managed to run a business and be a shrewd businesswoman. Her voyage to Australia was heartbreaking. She came on the worst convict fleet that existed. And as she crossed the Southern Ocean, she's in a dreadful convict ship. She's pregnant. She has a little child, a toddler, in her arms. He's sick, her husband's sick, and she's pitched and tossed as she sails on the Southern Ocean in the storms of winter. And she ended up going into premature labour, and she gave birth to a little baby girl who only lived for an hour. A few weeks later, she turns up in Sydney Cove to find a colony that's suffering from famine, that for 2 years has had no news from home, and from there she started to make a life for herself and for her family, and managed to admirably. She farmed at Elizabeth Farm in Parramatta, and then later down at Camden in New South Wales. She did have sheep, and that's what she's famous for, but she also farmed cattle, fine horses. They had retail businesses, they traded in the South Seas, they had sailing and whaling businesses as well. So she's certainly not a one-dimensional woman. She's an interesting, fascinating subject that sheds a whole new light on those first 60 years of the Australian colony. For my research, I had plenty of primary sources to use. Her letters, her diaries are all still there, but I'm not an historian, and in fact until recently I didn't call myself a writer. And I would say to all emerging writers, just bite off more than you can chew and just keep chewing. You become an expert when you start reading about it. You don't have to write what you know, you can write towards what you want to know and find out what you need to know along the way. You don't have to be an expert when you begin, because you certainly will be by the time you finish. I was also supported by Writers Victoria, by the ACT Writers Centre, by the Varuna, the Writers House. There are plenty of resources out there for emerging writers that you can draw on and seek advice from, and I highly recommend them to you. They've been a key support for me, and in fact the whole reason I'm published is because of organisations like those. So again, my thanks to the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts and the Thomas Keneally Centre. They have a copy of my book in their beautiful library, which was established in 1833. If you'd like to go and read it, just pop in the heart of Sydney, get a little quiet space and a comfy chair and sit down and read about a fascinating, intelligent woman. You won't regret it. Thanks.